something genuinely significant was happening at the 2026 BNP Paribas Open at Indian Wells, and it was visible to anyone paying attention to the actual evidence rather than the official rankings and seedings. Alex Eala was generating a level of crowd energy, commercial interest, and global attention that bore no relationship to her position in the draw as an unseeded player ranked in the low 30s. Her matches were filling courts to capacity. Her name was driving social media conversation in volumes that exceeded what players ranked far above her were producing. The Filipino community across California and the broader United States had shown up in numbers that transformed every venue she played in into something the tournament's planning had not fully prepared for. The Eala effect at Indian Wells in 2026 was real, documented, and commercially significant in ways that the people running the event could see clearly in their attendance figures and their engagement numbers. If you want full coverage of everything happening around Eala's Indian Wells campaign and her broader 2026 season, subscribe to this channel now and hit the bell. We cover the real story of what is happening around this player with the evidence and the context it deserves without the spin. Now let us talk about what was actually going on at Indian Wells and why the scale of it mattered beyond any individual match result. The attendance reality around Eala's matches at Indian Wells was one of the most discussed topics in the tournament's media center, and among the commercial teams responsible for managing the event's scheduling and court assignments. She was playing in Stadium 3, a court that holds a significantly smaller crowd than the main showcase venues, and for her late-night match against Diana Yastremska, thousands of Filipino fans had turned out and kept the energy at a volume and intensity that the court was not really designed to contain. The atmosphere did not belong to a Stadium 3 match in the opening rounds of a WTA 1000 event. It belonged to a Grand Slam quarterfinal on a show court, and the people inside that stadium were providing it until midnight without any sign of diminishing. The commercial data that surrounded her presence in the draw was equally striking. Ticket sales for sessions in which she was scheduled to play were significantly higher than baseline. Her matches were generating social media engagement in volumes that the tournament's marketing team had not seen from a player her ranking level. The merchandise and concession revenue in areas where Filipino fan activity was concentrated was reflecting the spending patterns of a large, enthusiastic, and committed audience. Tournament operations, people working across different departments, were all seeing the same thing through their own particular lens, that this player's presence in the draw was creating economic value that the rankings did not predict, and that the existing scheduling frameworks had not been set up to capture. The scheduling question was the most practically significant tension at the event. How do you allocate court resources when a player ranked outside the top 30 is demonstrably generating more public interest and commercial activity than players ranked in the top 10? The professional tennis tour's scheduling systems are built around an assumption that visibility and commercial value track with ranking. The number one seed gets the center court. The defending champion gets the primetime slot. The system makes sense in most circumstances because rankings and commercial value have historically moved together. Eala was breaking that assumption in a way that the system was not built to handle, and the tournament scheduling team was navigating that reality in real time. The tournament director's position was straightforward when the evidence was laid out clearly. The data from the Filipino community's engagement with this tournament was not ambiguous. It was a real commercial asset. Turning away fans, restricting access, or minimizing her court assignments to protect the broadcast aesthetic of the matches happening on the bigger courts would have been a decision that prioritized theory over the observable reality of where the money and the attention were actually going. The business case for embracing the Eala effect was clear. The business case for suppressing it was not there. The Pinoy Army, as the Filipino fan community supporting Eala has come to be called, had demonstrated across multiple tournaments through the season that they were not a local phenomenon. They were a globally distributed, coordinated, and deeply committed fan base that planned their attendance at tournaments months in advance, that traveled long distances to be in the building when she played, and that maintained their energy and their noise through late-night matches on small courts without any sign of fatigue. At Indian Wells, they had arrived in the numbers and with the organization that their history at every previous event had predicted. They had filled Stadium 3 for a midnight match and created an atmosphere that the commentators could hear from the next court over. The broader pattern of what Eala was generating commercially across the 2026 season placed the Indian Wells reality in context. Nike had invested in her at a scale that reflected their assessment of her long term global value, not just to the tennis market, but to the Southeast Asian market that her story was opening up. Sponsors across multiple categories were engaging with her because of the specific quality of the Filipino fan base's engagement with anything she touched. They were not passive viewers who watched her matches on television and moved on. They were active consumers who followed every endorsement, attended events in person, bought merchandise, and spread her story through their own social networks with a genuine enthusiasm that no marketing campaign could replicate. This is the commercial context that made the scheduling decisions at Indian Wells more than a logistical question. Every time Eala played on a court too small to accommodate the crowd that wanted to be there, the tournament was leaving attendance revenue and goodwill on the table. Every time a Filipino fan was turned away because the court was full, that was a person who had traveled potentially a long distance and spent money on tickets and transport and accommodation, and who was going home with a negative experience of an event that had failed to plan for her presence adequately. The Australian Open had already been through this learning process in January, acknowledged publicly that the scheduling had been wrong, and committed to doing better. Indian Wells was watching that experience and making its own decisions about how to handle the same challenge. The locker room dynamics around Ayla's commercial profile were something that professional tennis was navigating carefully and not always comfortably. Players who had spent years building their careers through wins, through rankings, through the slow and often difficult accumulation of title after title at progressively more important tournaments, were watching a player ranked significantly below them generate commercial attention and tournament atmosphere that exceeded what they were producing. That contrast created genuine tension, not because anyone was behaving badly, but because it exposed a real and growing gap between how the tour's official hierarchy valued players and how the market and the public actually valued them. Yula's situation was not unique in the history of sport. Commercial value and official competitive ranking have always had an imperfect relationship. Certain athletes transcend the rankings or the league table or the world ranking list because of what they represent to a specific community or because of the particular quality of the story their career is telling at a given moment. When that happens, the institutions managing the sport face a choice about whether to adapt their frameworks around the new reality or to defend the existing system at the cost of the commercial opportunity the new reality represents. Indian Wells, to its credit, was working through that choice in real time rather than defaulting to the path of least institutional disruption. The Nike relationship added a specific dimension to the Indian Wells story that went beyond the immediate tournament context. Nike's commercial decision making is not sentimental. They are one of the most analytically sophisticated sports marketing organizations in the world, and they do not make significant long term commitments to athletes on the basis of potential alone. Their assessment of Eala's commercial value reflected genuine analysis of the size, the engagement quality, and the global distribution of the audience she was building. When they made that assessment and committed to her at the level they did, they were also making an implicit statement about the direction they believed the commercial future of women's tennis was moving. The Southeast Asian market and the Filipino diaspora specifically was no longer peripheral to the sport's commercial story. It was becoming central to it, and Eala was the person through whom that transition was happening. The ticket revenue data from her Indian Wells sessions reflected this in the most direct possible way. Secondary market prices for matches she was scheduled to play in had been running at significant premiums above face value since the draw was released. The Filipino community in California, the largest in the United States, was not simply buying tickets to a tennis tournament. They were buying into a moment, a community gathering, a shared expression of national pride that happened to be located in the desert east of Los Angeles. The emotional investment behind those ticket purchases was qualitatively different from the investment that drives standard tournament attendance, and it showed in the energy inside the venues during her matches in ways that were unmistakable to anyone present. The late night Stadium 3 match against Yastremska encapsulated everything. A midnight finish in a smaller court, deep into an American hardcourt event that had not been specifically designed around her potential deep run, with thousands of fans who had no expectation of the match being over at a reasonable hour and who did not leave regardless. The volume, the flags, the sustained chanting across hours of competitive tennis well into the California night was a demonstration of the specific quality of the community she had built. This was not fair weather support. This was not a crowd that showed up because the tournament had promoted the match heavily or because it was on the main court with good television positioning. This was a crowd that had come specifically for her and that stayed specifically for her and that generated an atmosphere that no amount of marketing can purchase. Ayla's own response to the attention and the pressure surrounding her presence at Indian Wells was consistent with how she had handled every previous iteration of this situation. She competed, she stayed focused on the tennis. She did not perform for the cameras or manage her public persona to amplify the external narrative around her. She showed up at the baseline, played the points in front of her, and let the community she had built through 3 years of professional results and genuine engagement with the people who followed her take care of everything else. The composure was not manufactured. It was the product of a season's worth of experience competing in exactly these kinds of environments. And it showed in the quality of her matches when the atmosphere was at its most intense. The path from Indian Wells to the Miami Open carried its own momentum. She had earned ranking points in the California desert that advanced her career standing and her seeding prospects for subsequent tournaments. She was arriving in Miami as a seeded player for the first time at that event, returning to the venue where her breakthrough the previous year had changed the trajectory of everything. The Miami Open, with its large Filipino community in South Florida and its history as the site of her most significant results to date, represented the next chapter of a story that Indian Wells had just added another major paragraph to what the full Indian Wells week had confirmed across the match results and the crowd data and the commercial activity and the scheduling conversations was that the yellow phenomenon had not been a temporary spike in interest that would settle back to the baseline once the novelty wore off. It was a sustained, growing, commercially real force that was reshaping the economic geography of the WTA calendar in ways that tournament directors and commercial partners were actively adjusting their planning to accommodate. The institutions that move fastest to understand and embrace this reality were going to be the ones that captured the most of what it offered. The ones that treated it as a novelty or an exception were going to find themselves making the same mistakes that Melbourne had made in January and looking back at their experience with the same phrase the Australian Open had used, taking it as a learning. The learning was available to everyone who was paying attention. The evidence was not ambiguous and it was not limited to a single event. From Melbourne to Dubai to Indian Wells, the pattern had been consistent and consistent and consistent again. Eala in the draw meant crowds the planning had not anticipated, engagement the marketing had not produced, and commercial activity the budgets had not projected. The tournament that took that reality seriously and built their scheduling and their operations around it got something extraordinary. The tournament that treated it as a scheduling inconvenience got the same thing anyway, just more chaotically. Miami was the next opportunity for a major event to make the right choice. The Hard Rock Stadium, with its 13,000 seat capacity on the main court and its deep roots in the South Florida Filipino community, was better positioned than most venues to handle the scale of what was coming. Whether the planning and scheduling decisions matched that capacity was what the tournament week would reveal. Eala was ready, the community behind her was ready. The story that Indian Wells had told across a week of late nights and packed small courts and midnight matches filled with blue, red, and white flags was heading south on I-95 toward Miami, and the next chapter was already being written before the first ball was struck.